Hello folks, exciting news. So we are on to the last set of factors. Exciting. As ever, I'm going to start on page 12 because it's a useful, get my words out, framework to go back to. We are in the final column, social/cultural factors, and there are 5 of these. I'm going to attempt to try and get through all 5 in one video. Whether that works or not, I don't know, but we'll give it a go. Okay, there are 5 left, then we'll have done all 17, and what we will then do is we'll start trying to link them together and do a bit of recapping. Okay, so if you've got sort of quite a few questions, etc., hopefully in that video it'll all make sense. Without further ado then, let's start on education, for which you need page 44. Okay, page 44. Right, there are 2 sort of main elements. The poverty trap. We've kind of talked about this before. You might remember that way at the start of this module, when we were still at college and in class, we did a cutting and sticking exercise where you were trying to work out all of the problems facing LDCs and how they all link together. This is a very simplified version of that. And the basic idea in the context of education is, if people don't get a good standard of education, it limits the kind of job they are capable of getting. That means you tend to be on a low income, and if you're on a low income, you kind of get stuck in terms of how far you can get. And that tends to perpetuate itself down the generations. So you tend to kind of get stuck with that, okay? So if you live in a country with low levels of education, it can keep you stuck at a low level of development. It's a kind of, as it says, poverty trap. But the other thing about it is some revision from year 1. Sorry, I'll come to that in a minute. Some revision from year 1, which is the whole brain drain migration sort of thing. So there's some information about this on page 45 of the module booklet, and there's a lovely little case study about a man called Jelani Aliyu. And there is a video and a hyperlink on the screen in front of you that you can see. And you are obviously very welcome to open these. This PowerPoint is called something like Social Factors Affecting Development. I've tried to give every PowerPoint a really kind of obvious name to help you. Right, let's just remind ourselves then. Migration is a movement of people, and one of the negative aspects of migration is something called the brain drain, which means that generally you will lose your best people, your brightest, best prospects will often leave the country, particularly if it's a less developed country, because they will be aware of the fact that their opportunities are minimal in the country that they were born in, and they will want to achieve higher than that. So you lose your best people. And there's a really brilliant example. I'm afraid it's a Nigerian example as opposed to one of our 5 countries, for which I apologise. It's on page 45, and like I say, you've got a website and a little video clip that you can have a look at for that. So that's a little bit of year 1 revision. It's a nice synoptic link if you get a chance to talk about it as well. Okay, the other link with education is back to something we've talked about in a previous video, which is multinational investment. One of the ways that the current NICs like China have developed is because they've managed to attract these massive multinational companies, and by building factories, etc., that has triggered a multiplier effect, and they are developing. One of the minor factors that potentially could put multinationals off investing is low levels of education. And as you can see on this map, sub-Saharan Africa does rather stand out as having reasonably low levels of education. So education kind of affects individuals, it affects investment, it affects all sorts. And I can just prove to you with this data look that unfortunately the situation in sub-Saharan Africa is much worse than other parts of the world in terms of the percentage of people who are not at school. There are also some figures on page 45. So for example, it says at the top, Africa has made tremendous strides towards achieving universal primary education, but 40% of primary school leavers cannot read. So what we're saying here is it's all well and good to get more kids going to school, but if the quality of the education they receive is not particularly brilliant, you are not going to improve the standards of education in that country. Okay? But really, education can be summed up with the paragraph at the bottom of page 45. Education is a strategic factor in development, etc., etc. So that's the paragraph to maybe highlight, circle, etc., etc. Okay, so a huge impact, but not all that much to know. I will just emphasise, because I haven't mentioned it yet, we take for granted, I think, in the UK that both education and healthcare are free. Can I please emphasise that that is not true for many countries in sub-Saharan Africa? Now, you can find out for the 5 countries what the situation is in those, but it's not true that health and education is free in all of the countries of the world. We are exceptionally lucky in the UK to have that situation. So it's just a bit of a reminder. Okay, health. Page 46. Now, here's an interesting thing. It is not, have a look at the bar graph, true to say that more people die in Africa than in any other part of the world. That's actually not true. But what we're going to focus on for health is why people die. And what the key idea of this section is that people who die in sub-Saharan Africa often die of preventable causes, i.e. they die of something that they didn't need to die from. Okay, so if you have a look at that graph in front of you, if you lived in the United Kingdom, quite a lot of those things on that graph you could have been vaccinated against, or you might have clean water to drink, which means you're much less likely to get that particular problem. Or your standard of living might be better, so you're less likely to get ill. Quite a few of those would be preventable in the UK. All right, and that's what we're trying to say. People die of things in sub-Saharan Africa that they don't need to die from. That's kind of the key idea. And on page 46 of the module, it's pretty obvious. It says, the effects of health on development are clear. Countries with weak health and education conditions find it harder to achieve sustained growth. Indeed, economic evidence confirms that a 10% improvement in life expectancy is associated with a rise in economic growth. This is because people either can't work because they're too poorly, or maybe they're caring for a family member. So illness and disease means an ineffective workforce. That's a real problem. It also means that you, depending on whether your health service is free or not, you might be paying to look after these people. If the government isn't paying, the family may well be paying, which means their quality of life is not getting better because they're just trying to pay medical bills all the time. So it has this huge kind of problem. Now, I've done a few slides, which I'm not going to dwell on, but for those of you who are interested, I've done a little focus on some of the preventable diseases and illnesses that are prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa that you might want to find out a little bit more about. So we've got HIV and AIDS, which I'm sure you'll know can be prevented with contraception, clean needles, all those kind of things. Guinea worms, which is just to do with clean drinking water. Malaria, which does have links to physical geography. We're just quite lucky we don't live in a malaria-prone part of the world, but equally you can reduce the threat of malaria with nets and insecticides and all sorts of things. So people don't need to be dying from malaria. And Ebola, which there was a recent outbreak of Ebola in both Sierra Leone and DR Congo. So that's just for you to investigate if you're interested. This is the key idea. Okay, most people in sub-Saharan Africa die from things that they do not need to die from. If they could vaccinate, for example, against tuberculosis, which we used to do routinely in the UK, and we've pretty much stamped tuberculosis out. If we could improve the health, it would probably mean that there's an extra 13 billion American dollars that could be used for development. So there's all these other things. I'm not going to say too much about this in this video, just to pick up on this graph again. Once we've worked our way through the factors, which has taken us lots and lots of videos, we have got a few other sort of sections at the end of this module, and one of them is about kind of what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa right now, and there is some development, and weirdly, one of the kind of most obvious things that's happening is that the causes of death are changing. So high income patterns of disease, so people in developed countries tend to have more issues with cardiovascular disease, tend to have more issues with sedentary lifestyle illnesses and diseases and things like that, and they're just beginning to see their causes of death change, which would suggest that there is some development happening, but more on that another time. Welfare. Okay, we live in a country that has a welfare state, and what that means is the government looks after people who need to be looked after. Okay, so old age pensioners get a pension, and people get job seekers allowance, and if you're not well enough to work, you get benefits, and so on. Welfare has a very strong link to governance because it's the government that puts it into place. And essentially, the idea is that welfare is fantastic for quality of life because it means that the most vulnerable people in your society get help and support and everything that they need. Not many sub-Saharan African countries have enough money to be able to put welfare in place. And also, they've got bigger problems going on. You can kind of only begin to deal with welfare as an issue once you've tackled, you know, conflict and genocide and all the big horrible things that might be happening. The best example that you can find within our 5 countries for welfare is Botswana. And there's some really lovely information on page 47 about that. Gender, okay, page 48. Now this, I have to confess, obviously I'm a fully paid up feminist. I would imagine that's pretty obvious to everybody, as I hope you are too. I was really flabbergasted about this, I have to be honest and say, I knew that obviously equality is something that we should be aiming for from a moral and fairness point of view. I didn't really ever consider that gender discrimination might have an economic impact, but it does, which is incredible, really. There's quite a lot of information on page 48. None of it is particularly difficult to understand, but there's one figure that is worth highlighting, ladies and gents. It's about a third of the way down, page 48. A new report finds economic and social discrimination against women is costing Africa more than $100 billion a year, which is insane, isn't it, really? And what that video explains to you much better than I could is why gender discrimination has an economic impact. Traditionally, in lower income, less developed countries, you will see gender discrimination in a much more exaggerated way. And because, of course, we know that the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are generally at the bottom of the pile in terms of levels of development, we do have some pretty stark gender differences. Again, information on page 48 about that. Okay, now I've only got less than a minute. I'm not going to try and do ethnic divisions in less than a minute. So the second part of this video will cover ethnicity and we'll also begin to look at some case studies for this. Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gents. Be good if I could work my computer. Right, see you next time. Thank you.